Some secrets are buried so deep they change everything when they surface. For men who've worked the same land their fathers worked, the earth beneath holds more than memories. In 1892, grizzled rancher Silas Boone discovers a hidden tunnel beneath his failing ranch house. Below lies a forgotten hideout filled with Confederate gold, tribal relics, and a blood-stained journal revealing a dark, wartime pact. With his ranch crumbling and his body failing, Silas reaches out to his estranged brother, a former lawman turned drunk, to help make sense of their discovery. As buried secrets surface, the brothers must face old betrayals, stolen land, and the heavy cost of silence. But what price will they pay for the truth they've uncovered? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Boone Ranch, highlighting every weathered fence post and sagging gate that told the story of better days gone by. Silas Boone stood on his front porch, coffee growing cold in his gnarled hands, watching the last of his cattle graze on grass that grew thinner each year. At 62, his body carried the accumulated weight of decades spent wrestling with unforgiving land, and his face bore the deep lines that came from squinting into too many harsh sunrises. The ranch house behind him groaned in the morning breeze, its timbers settling like old bones. 3 generations of Boones had called this place home, had worked this land when it was green and profitable, when cattle fetched good prices and rain came when it was supposed to. Now the paint peeled from the clapboard siding, and several shingles had blown off in last month's storm, leaving dark patches on the roof, like missing teeth in an old man's smile. Silas pulled his father's pocket watch from his vest, its brass surface tarnished black in places where his thumb had worn away the finish over the years. The timepiece had belonged to his father, Jonas Boone, and his grandfather before that. Its steady tick had marked time through 3 generations of struggle and triumph, through good years and lean ones, through births and deaths and everything in between. The weight of it in his palm felt heavier than its actual substance, as if it carried not just the mechanism of time, but the accumulated hopes and disappointments of everyone who had owned it. "Señor Silas," Miguel Hernandez called from the barn, his voice carrying that particular tone that meant more bad news. Miguel had worked the ranch for 15 years, since he was barely 18, and had become more than a hired hand. He was the closest thing to family Silas had left. Though neither man would admit such sentiment aloud, Silas tucked the watch back into his pocket and walked toward the barn, his boots raising small clouds of dust with each step. The drought had been merciless this year, turning what should have been pasture into something closer to hardpan. The well was running low, and he'd had to sell off half his herd just to pay for feed for the rest. "What is it this time?" Silas asked, though he could read the answer in Miguel's expression before the younger man spoke. 3 more cows are sick," Miguel said, removing his hat to run a hand through his dark hair. "Same thing as the others. They won't eat, just stand around looking poorly." "I think we need to call the veterinarian from town." Silas felt his jaw tighten. The veterinarian cost money he didn't have, but losing more cattle would cost him even more. It was the kind of calculation that had become routine over the past few years, weighing one financial disaster against another and choosing the lesser evil. "How many does that make?" he asked. 7 total. "Maybe 8 if that little heifer by the north fence doesn't perk up soon." 7 head of cattle. In his father's day, the loss of 7 cattle would have been unfortunate but manageable. Now it represented nearly a quarter of what remained of the Boone herd. Each animal was worth approximately $40, money that might as well have been $40,000 for all the chance Silas had of replacing it. "Send word to Doc Hartley," Silas said finally. "Tell him it's urgent." Miguel nodded and headed toward the house to pen a message, leaving Silas alone with his thoughts and the sound of cattle lowing in the distance. He leaned against the barn door and surveyed his domain, trying to see it through his father's eyes. Or his grandfather's. They had built something here, carved a life out of raw land, through sheer stubborn will and backbreaking labor. The irony wasn't lost on him that he might be the generation that lost it all. The mortgage payment was due in 6 weeks. Silas had already spoken to the bank twice about extensions, and while Ezra Morrison, the bank president, had been sympathetic, sympathy didn't pay bills. The ranch was worth something, certainly, but in its current state, and with cattle prices what they were, it wouldn't fetch enough to clear the debt and leave anything for a fresh start. Not that Silas wanted a fresh start. This land was in his blood, had shaped him from boyhood. Every fence post driven, every barn raised, every field cleared, carried the sweat and determination of Boone men. To lose it now would be to dishonor everything his family had worked for, to break a chain that stretched back to when Texas was still a republic and the West was truly wild. His thoughts turned, as they often did these days, to his brother Thomas. 5 years younger, Thomas had left the ranch at 18 with big dreams and a badge, determined to make his mark as a lawman in a territory that desperately needed honest peace officers. For a while, it had seemed like Thomas might succeed. Letters had come from various frontier towns, each one describing another criminal brought to justice, another small victory for law and order in a place where both were scarce commodities. But somewhere along the way, something had broken inside Thomas. The letters had grown shorter, then stopped altogether. When Silas had finally tracked him down 2 years ago, he'd found his brother in a saloon in Amarillo, drunk and belligerent, wearing a badge that looked like it hadn't been polished in months. They'd argued. Harsh words about family duty and responsibility had been exchanged, and Thomas had made it clear that he wanted nothing more to do with the ranch or the weight of Boone expectations. The argument still sat heavy in Silas's chest, a knot of regret and stubborn pride that grew tighter every time he thought about it. Thomas was the only family he had left, the only person who understood what this place meant and what it had cost their family over the years. But pride was a luxury neither of them could afford, and Silas had let it drive a wedge between them that might never be repaired. "Senor Silas," Miguel called from the house, interrupting his brooding. "A man here to see you." Silas walked back toward the house, wondering who might be calling at this hour. It was too early for the banker, too late for a neighbor with the kind of casual visit that marked better times. As he rounded the corner of the house, he saw a man in a dusty black suit standing next to a tired-looking horse, his face bearing the kind of serious expression that usually accompanied bad news. "Mr. Boone," the man asked, extending a hand. "Name's Garrett Walsh. I represent the Territorial Land Office." Silas shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze that suggested this was a man accustomed to delivering difficult messages. "What can I do for you, Mr. Walsh?" "I'm afraid I have some questions about your land patents, sir. There's been some irregularities discovered in the territorial records, and we need to verify the legitimacy of certain claims in this area." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. Land patents were the foundation of everything, the legal documents that proved ownership and gave a man the right to work his property. If there were questions about the patents, it could mean trouble beyond anything a few sick cattle or an overdue mortgage could cause. "What kind of irregularities?" Silas asked, keeping his voice steady despite the alarm bells ringing in his head. "That's what we're trying to determine, sir. May I ask if you have the original documentation? Your grandfather's initial claim papers? Any correspondence with territorial officials?" Silas nodded slowly. "In the house. My father kept everything in a strongbox. I'd appreciate the opportunity to examine those documents, if you don't mind. This is just routine verification, you understand. We're checking several properties in the county." But Silas could tell from the man's manner that this was anything but routine. There was an urgency beneath the polite words, a sense that whatever had brought Walsh to his door was more serious than a simple paperwork review. As they walked toward the house, Silas found himself thinking again about his father's pocket watch, about the weight of time and legacy, and the countless decisions that had brought him to this moment. The watch had measured good times and bad, had ticked steadily through prosperity and hardship alike. Now it seemed to be marking time towards some conclusion he couldn't yet see, but could feel approaching like a storm on the horizon. Inside the house, Silas retrieved the strongbox from his father's old desk, the key still hanging on the chain where Jonas Boone had left it. As he opened the metal container and began laying out papers that documented 3 generations of Boone ownership, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was about to change, that the steady rhythm of his life was about to be disrupted in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The morning sun continued its steady climb, casting new shadows and revealing details that had been hidden in the earlier light. And somewhere beneath his feet, in the space between the floorboards and the earth, secrets waited that would change everything he thought he knew about his family and the land they had called home for so many years. Walsh spent the better part of 2 hours examining the documents, his face growing more troubled with each paper he reviewed. When he finally looked up from the desk, his expression carried the weight of unpleasant conclusions. "Mr. Boone, I'm afraid there are some serious discrepancies here. The signatures on your grandfather's original claim don't match the territorial records we have on file. Furthermore, the survey markers described in these papers don't align with the current property boundaries." Silas felt the ground shift beneath his feet, though he remained standing in his own parlor. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that there may be questions about the legal validity of your family's claim to this land. This will require a thorough investigation, and I'm afraid that until it's resolved, any transfer of the property will be suspended." After Walsh departed with promises to be in touch soon, Silas found himself alone in the house that suddenly felt less like home and more like borrowed space. The walls that had sheltered 3 generations of his family now seemed to lean inward, oppressive and uncertain. He needed air, needed to move, needed to do something with his hands, while his mind grappled with the implications of what he'd just heard. In the parlor, he began moving furniture, looking for something, anything, that might have value enough to help with the mortgage payment. Behind his father's old reading chair, he noticed that one of the floorboards seemed to sit differently than the others, slightly raised, as if the nails had worked loose over time. Silas knelt and examined the board more closely. It was definitely loose, warped just enough to create a small gap. Using his pocket knife, he pried at the board until it came free, revealing a dark space beneath. The smell that rose from the opening was musty and old, carrying hints of earth and something else he couldn't identify. He retrieved a lantern from the kitchen and lowered it into the opening. The light revealed not just a crawl space, but what appeared to be the entrance to a tunnel carved directly into the earth beneath the house. The walls were shored up with timber, suggesting this wasn't a natural formation but something deliberately constructed. Silas had lived in this house for 62 years, had crawled under it as a boy to retrieve lost balls and hide from chores, had repaired the foundation stones more times than he could count. He had never seen any evidence of this tunnel, which meant it had been carefully concealed and deliberately kept secret. Lowering himself through the opening proved more challenging than he'd anticipated. His aging joints protested, and the tunnel was narrow enough that he had to crawl on hands and knees, pushing the lantern ahead of him. The earthen walls pressed close on either side, and more than once he wondered if he was making a terrible mistake. After perhaps 20 feet, the tunnel opened into a chamber large enough for him to stand upright. The lantern light revealed a space that had clearly been used for storage, though what he saw there made no immediate sense. Against one wall sat a collection of wooden crates, their surfaces bearing the marks of age, but still structurally sound. Scattered around the chamber were various objects that seemed to have no connection to each other, pieces of what appeared to be Native American artifacts, some kind of military equipment, and papers tied with string. But it was the leather-bound journal sitting open on a makeshift table that drew his attention first. The book's pages were yellowed with age, and dark stains marked the cover and several of the visible pages. As Silas lifted the journal closer to the lantern light, he realized with a start that the stains looked very much like dried blood. The handwriting on the open page was familiar, though it took him a moment to place it. When recognition came, it hit him like a physical blow. The careful script belonged to his father, Jonas Boone, but the words written there were unlike anything Silas had ever associated with the man who had raised him. April 15th, 1863, the entry began. The deed is done. Spotted Wolf and his delegation will trouble us no more. T says we had no choice, that they would never have agreed to the terms peacefully. Perhaps he's right, but the blood on my hands feels heavier than any gold we might gain from this business. Silas read the passage twice, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were telling him. His father had been a rancher, a man who had built his life through honest work and fair dealing. The idea that Jonas Boone had been involved in violence, in the kind of treachery suggested by these words, contradicted everything Silas had believed about his family's history. He turned the page, hoping for context that might explain away what he'd read. Instead, he found more entries that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. April 20th, 1863. The tribal lands are ours now. T assures me the papers will be filed correctly, and our claim will be unquestioned. The gold is more than we discussed, but the cost was higher too. I pray my sons never learn what price was paid for the ground they will inherit. The words seemed to swim before his eyes. Tribal lands, gold, a cost that his father prayed his sons would never discover. Silas set the journal down with trembling hands and turned his attention to the wooden crates. The first crate he opened contained what was unmistakably Confederate gold coins, perhaps 36 pieces that gleamed dully in the lantern light. The second held Native American artifacts, beaded ceremonial items, carved pipes, jewelry that spoke of skilled craftsmanship and cultural significance. The third crate contained military documents, maps, and correspondence that bore official seals and signatures. Silas sank onto a wooden box, the weight of discovery crushing down on him like a collapsed mine shaft. His father had been involved in something during the war, something that had involved the theft of tribal lands and the acquisition of gold through means that had clearly haunted Jonas Boone for the rest of his life. The implications were staggering. If the land his family had worked for 3 generations had been acquired through fraud or violence, then everything he'd built his life around was founded on a lie. The mortgage troubles, the questions about land patents, the sense that everything was falling apart. Suddenly, it all seemed connected to secrets that had been buried beneath his feet for 30 years. He picked up the journal again, reading entry after entry that detailed his father's involvement in what appeared to be a conspiracy involving Confederate officers, tribal leaders, and territorial officials. Names appeared repeatedly: Thomas Whitfield, Captain James Morrison, Chief Spotted Wolf. Some he recognized from local history. Others were completely unfamiliar. One entry, dated May 3rd, 1863, made his blood run cold. T. Whitfield is dead, killed by his own men when he threatened to expose our arrangement. Morrison says we must be more careful, that loose tongues will see us all hanged. I begin to think we are already damned, gold or no gold. Silas closed the journal, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the lantern. Thomas Whitfield had been murdered. His father had been party to murder, or at least had knowledge of it. The Confederate gold in the crates wasn't payment for services rendered. It was blood money, payment for betrayal and violence that had echoed down through the decades. He thought of his brother Thomas, somewhere out there wearing a lawman's badge while drinking away memories of failed justice. Thomas, who had always believed in right and wrong, who had left the ranch in pursuit of truth and fairness. How would he react to learning that their family's prosperity had been built on the kind of crimes he'd spent his career fighting? The chamber suddenly felt claustrophobic, the weight of earth above pressing down like the accumulated sins of the past. Silas gathered the journal and a few of the most damning documents, then made his way back through the tunnel to the parlor above. As he replaced the loose floorboard, he wondered if his father had ever returned to this chamber. If Jonas Boone had spent sleepless nights knowing what lay beneath his home, sitting in his father's chair. Silas opened the journal again and read more entries by lamplight. The picture that emerged was of a man trapped by circumstances and choices, a man who had taken what seemed like an opportunity, but had discovered too late the true cost of his decisions. The final entry, dated December 1863, was brief but chilling. The weight of this secret grows heavier each day. I have hidden the evidence where my sons will never find it, pray God. May they live clean lives on land I have forever stained. As night fell outside, Silas realized he faced an impossible choice. He could replace the floorboard, seal the tunnel, and try to forget what he had discovered. Or he could follow the path his father's journal had opened, seeking truth even if it destroyed everything he had left. But he knew, even as he considered his options, that he could not carry this burden alone. There was only one person who might understand, only one person whose sense of justice might help him navigate the moral wilderness he'd stumbled into. He would have to swallow his pride and contact Thomas. Whatever had happened between them, whatever words had been spoken in anger, his brother deserved to know what lay beneath the foundation of their family home. And perhaps together, they could find a way to face the sins of their father and determine what price justice might demand after 30 years of silence. The next morning found Silas sitting at his kitchen table, pen poised over paper, struggling to find words that would bring his brother home without revealing too much in a letter that might be read by others. Miguel moved quietly around the kitchen, preparing breakfast and casting occasional concerned glances at his employer, who had clearly spent a sleepless night wrestling with demons. "I need you to take a message to town," Silas said finally, folding the paper he'd written and rewritten 3 times. "To the telegraph office. It needs to go to Amarillo, to Sheriff Thomas Boone." Miguel took the letter without question, though his dark eyes reflected curiosity. In 15 years of working for the Boones, he had never known Silas to contact his estranged brother. Whatever had changed, it was significant enough to bridge years of stubborn silence. After Miguel departed for town, Silas returned to the parlor and lifted the loose floorboard once more. In daylight streaming through the windows, the opening seemed less ominous, but the weight of what lay beneath hadn't diminished. He descended into the tunnel again, this time bringing additional lanterns and a determination to understand the full scope of what his father had hidden. The Confederate gold coins drew his attention first, each piece bearing the distinctive design of the Confederate States of America. 30 pieces in total, each one worth considerable money even now, nearly 30 years after the Confederacy's collapse. But as Silas examined them more closely, he noticed something troubling. Several of the coins bore scratches and nicks that looked deliberate, as if someone had tested their authenticity by cutting into the metal. More disturbing still was the realization that 30 pieces of gold represented far more wealth than a simple rancher should have possessed during the war years. His father had always claimed the family's prosperity came from savvy cattle trading and careful land management. But 30 pieces of Confederate gold suggested a different source entirely. He turned his attention to the Native American artifacts, handling them with the reverence their obvious craftsmanship demanded. The beadwork on a ceremonial vest was intricate beyond anything he'd seen in local trading posts, speaking of hours of skilled labor and cultural significance that went far beyond mere decoration. A carved pipe bore symbols he didn't recognize but that clearly held spiritual meaning for whoever had created it. These weren't trinkets acquired through trade. They were the kind of personal, sacred items that would only leave their owner's possession through theft or violence. The thought made his stomach turn as he imagined the circumstances under which his father might have acquired them. Returning to the journal, Silas read deeper into his father's wartime activities. The picture that emerged was of a man who had started as a small-time smuggler running goods between Union and Confederate territories, but who had gradually become involved in something much darker. Names of Confederate officers appeared frequently, along with references to payments and territorial arrangements that suggested corruption at the highest levels. One entry from June 1863 particularly caught his attention. Morrison grows more demanding. He wants guarantees that the tribal settlement will be permanent, that there will be no survivors to contest the new boundaries. I fear we have moved beyond mere theft into something far worse. The gold feels heavier each day, as if it carries the weight of souls. Captain James Morrison. Silas remembered that name from local history, though the man he recalled hearing about had been portrayed as a war hero, someone who had helped bring peace to the territory after years of conflict. The idea that Morrison might have been involved in the elimination of tribal claims through violence rather than negotiation recast everything Silas thought he knew about the area's history. Miguel returned from town with a receipt for the telegram and news that made Silas's current troubles seem even more pressing. "Senor, the man at the bank was asking questions about you. Wanted to know if you had any assets he might not know about, any property or valuables that could secure the mortgage." The timing couldn't have been worse. Here he sat with enough Confederate gold to pay off the mortgage twice over, but using it would require explaining where it came from. And given what he was learning about his father's activities, that explanation might lead to revelations that would destroy not just his own reputation, but the memory of Jonas Boone. "What did you tell him?" Silas asked. "Nothing, senor. I said I was just a hired hand and didn't know about such things. But he seemed to think you might be hiding something." The irony was bitter. He was hiding something, but not what the banker suspected. The wealth beneath his floorboards could solve his immediate financial problems, but at a cost that grew more terrible with each journal entry he read. That afternoon, while Miguel tended to the cattle, Silas found himself thinking about the stories his father had told during his childhood. Jonas Boone had been sparing with details about his war years, usually deflecting questions with jokes or changing the subject entirely. When pressed, he would mention hardships and difficult choices, but always in vague terms that left more questions than answers. Now Silas wondered if those vague references had been clues he'd been too young to understand. Had his father been trying to prepare him for revelations that might come later? Or had Jonas been wrestling with guilt that demanded some form of confession, even if only in hints and half-truths? One memory in particular stood out. When Silas was perhaps 12 years old, he had found his father sitting on the front porch long after sunset, staring out at the land with an expression of profound sadness. When asked what was wrong, Jonas had said, "Sometimes a man pays a price for his choices that goes beyond money, son. Sometimes the debt follows you for the rest of your life." At the time, Silas had assumed his father was talking about the usual struggles of ranch life, the endless cycle of financial pressures and physical demands. Now he understood that Jonas Boone had been carrying a much heavier burden, the weight of decisions that had secured his family's future at a cost he could never fully repay. The sound of hoofbeats in the yard drew Silas from his memories. Through the window, he saw a rider approaching at speed, dust trailing behind the horse in a way that suggested urgent business. As the rider drew closer, Silas recognized the uniform of a territorial deputy, which made his heart race with immediate concern. The deputy dismounted and approached the house with the kind of purposeful stride that usually accompanied official business. Silas met him at the door, fighting to keep his expression neutral despite the turmoil in his mind. "Mr. Boone." "Deputy Marshal Crawford, I've got some questions about your property that need answering." The questions, it turned out, were related to Walsh's investigation, but they went deeper than simple paperwork verification. Crawford wanted to know about the original survey markers, about any evidence of previous occupation of the land, about anything that might shed light on how the Boone claim had been established. As Silas answered as honestly as he could, without revealing what he'd discovered beneath his floorboards, he realized that forces beyond his control were converging on his family's secrets. Walsh's investigation, the bank's pressure, the deputy's questions, all of it pointed toward a reckoning that might be inevitable, regardless of what he chose to do with his father's journal. That evening, as he sat alone in the parlor above the hidden chamber, Silas understood that he was running out of time. Whatever his father had done 30 years ago was catching up with the present, and soon he would have to choose between protecting his family's reputation and facing the truth about how their prosperity had been purchased. The Confederate gold coins below seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. 30 pieces of metal that had bought something precious at a price that could never be repaid. And somewhere out there, Thomas was receiving a telegram that would bring him home to face secrets that might destroy everything they both believed about their family and themselves. 3 days after sending the telegram, Silas heard the unmistakable sound of a horse being ridden hard up the road to the ranch. From the parlor window, he watched his brother Thomas approach, swaying slightly in the saddle, in a way that suggested he'd been drinking long before reaching the property line. Even at a distance, Thomas looked like a man who had been fighting a losing battle with life itself. Thomas Boone dismounted with the careful deliberation of someone who wasn't entirely steady on his feet. He wore a lawman's badge on a vest that had seen better days, and his gun belt sat crooked on his hips. His face, once clean-shaven and proud, now bore several days' worth of stubble and the ruddy complexion of a man too familiar with whiskey. "Hello, Silas," Thomas said as he approached the porch, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone expecting conflict. "Got your telegram. Sounded urgent enough to drag me away from important business in Amarillo." Silas could smell the alcohol before his brother reached the steps. "Important business? Is that what they're calling it now?" "Don't start," Thomas warned, though there was more weariness than anger in his voice. "You asked me to come, so I came. What's so all-fired important that you'd break 5 years of silence?" For a moment, Silas wasn't sure how to begin. How did a man tell his brother that everything they'd believed about their family was built on a foundation of murder and theft? How did he explain that their childhood home sat atop evidence of crimes that could destroy whatever reputation the Boone name still carried? "We need to talk," Silas said finally. "Inside. And Thomas, you're going to want to be sober for this conversation." Thomas followed him into the house, his movements careful but still bearing traces of the confident stride that had once made him a respected peace officer. Silas poured coffee while Thomas settled into their father's old chair, a choice that seemed both natural and painful for both men. "You look like hell," Silas observed, setting the coffee cup within reach. "Feel worse than I look," Thomas replied, accepting the coffee with hands that trembled slightly. "Now what's this about? And don't tell me you called me here just to point out my obvious shortcomings." Silas took a deep breath and began with Walsh's visit. The questions about land patents and the discovery of the loose floorboard. He watched Thomas's expression change from skeptical annoyance to sharp attention as the story progressed. When he mentioned finding the tunnel, Thomas set down his coffee cup and leaned forward. "You're telling me there's a hidden chamber under this house that neither of us knew about in 60-some years of living here? Come see for yourself." Leading Thomas to the parlor, Silas lifted the loose floorboard and lowered a lantern into the opening. Thomas peered down into the tunnel, his lawman's instincts clearly engaged despite his current condition. "Jesus," Thomas whispered. "How long has this been here?" "Near as I can tell, since the war years. Maybe longer." Thomas insisted on going down first, his movements more sure underground than they had been on the surface. Silas followed, carrying additional lanterns that illuminated the chamber in stark detail. He watched his brother's face as Thomas took in the crates, the artifacts, and the journal still sitting open on the makeshift table. "Confederate gold," Thomas said, examining the coins with the practiced eye of someone who had dealt with evidence before. "These are genuine, and there's enough here to—" He stopped, the implications beginning to penetrate his alcohol-clouded thinking. Where did Father get this? Silas handed him the journal. "Read for yourself." Thomas read in silence, his expression growing darker with each page. Occasionally he would stop, go back and read a passage again, as if hoping the words might change meaning on second examination. When he finally looked up, his face was pale. "Murder," he said simply. "Father was involved in murder." "It gets worse," Silas said, directing his brother's attention to a small leather pouch he'd noticed tucked behind one of the crates. "Look at this." The pouch was clearly of Native American origin, decorated with intricate beadwork and containing what appeared to be sacred items, small carved figures, polished stones, and a bundle of herbs that still carried a faint scent despite the decades. Most disturbing was a folded piece of paper tucked inside the pouch, bearing writing in a different hand than their father's journal. Thomas unfolded the paper carefully, revealing what appeared to be a map with specific landmarks marked and notations in both English and what looked like tribal language. At the bottom, in English, were the words, "Sacred burial ground, never to be disturbed by agreement with Spotted Wolf, witnessed by Thomas Whitfield, sworn before God and nature." This was a sacred site, Thomas said quietly. "Father built our ranch on top of a tribal burial ground." The revelation hit both men like a physical blow. It was one thing to learn that their father had been involved in violence and theft. It was another entirely to realize that their family home, the land they had worked and loved for 3 generations, was built over the graves of people their father had helped to murder. "We have to report this," Thomas said, his voice steadying as his lawman's training took over. "All of it. The gold, the artifacts, the journal. There are laws about stolen property, about crimes against tribal peoples." "And lose everything?" Silas asked. "The ranch, the land, everything 3 generations of our family worked for? Built on murder, Silas, built on the bones of innocent people. How can we keep living here knowing what we know? How can we throw away everything without even trying to find another way? Maybe there's some statute of limitations. Maybe there's no statute of limitations on murder," Thomas interrupted. "And there shouldn't be on theft of this magnitude. Look at these artifacts. Each one represents someone's life, someone's culture, someone's sacred tradition that was stolen along with their land and their lives." Silas picked up the medicine pouch, feeling the weight of its contents and its meaning. "But what about Miguel? What about the people in town who depend on this ranch for work? What about justice?" Thomas shot back. "What about doing what's right instead of what's convenient?" They stared at each other across the chamber, the tension of 5 years of separation and a lifetime of different values crystallizing into this moment. Silas saw his brother as he used to be, upright, moral, uncompromising in his pursuit of justice. Thomas saw his brother as he'd always been, practical, protective of family, willing to bend rules if it meant preserving what mattered to him. But beneath the conflict, something else stirred. Thomas's hand was steadier now, his voice clearer. The shock of discovery seemed to have burned away some of the fog of alcohol and self-pity that had clouded his thinking. And Silas recognized, perhaps for the first time, the weight of moral obligation that his brother had carried all these years. "I need time to think," Silas said finally, "to figure out what the right thing is." "The right thing is obvious," Thomas replied, but his tone was gentler now. "The question is whether we have the courage to do it." As they climbed back up to the house, both men carried with them the weight of knowledge that would change everything. The medicine pouch in Silas's pocket seemed to pulse with the spiritual energy of its original owners, a reminder that some debts transcended generations and could never be repaid with mere money. That night, they sat on the front porch as they had as boys, looking out over land that no longer felt like home to either of them. The silence between them was heavy, but not hostile, filled with the shared understanding that their lives had been irrevocably altered by what lay beneath their feet. "I've made a mess of things," Thomas said quietly. The first admission of vulnerability he'd offered in years. "We both have," Silas replied. "The question is what we do about it now." In the distance, coyotes called to each other across the prairie, their voices carrying a wildness that reminded both men of what this land had been before their family claimed it, and what it might be again if they found the courage to face the truth their father had buried so deep. The next morning found both brothers back in the underground chamber, poring over the journal by lamplight like scholars studying some ancient text. Thomas had foregone his usual morning whiskey, his hands steadier and his mind clearer than it had been in months. The discovery had given him something he'd been missing, a purpose that demanded his full attention and his lawman's skills. "Listen to this," Thomas said, reading from an entry dated August 1863. "Morrison says the Union command suspects our activities, but the tribal leaders trust me completely. They believe I'm helping them negotiate a fair settlement with the territorial government. Tomorrow, I meet with Spotted Wolf to finalize what he thinks is a peace treaty. God forgive me, but it will be his death warrant instead." Silas felt sick as the full scope of his father's betrayal became clear. Jonas Boone hadn't simply been a bystander to violence. He had been an active participant in a conspiracy that used trust and diplomacy as weapons against people who had no reason to suspect. "A treachery. Keep reading," Silas said quietly. "See if he explains how they pulled it off." Thomas found the entry from the following day, his voice growing strained as he read aloud, "It is finished. Spotted Wolf came to the meeting place with only 3 warriors, trusting in the peace talks we had arranged. Morrison's men were waiting in ambush. When it was over, I helped bury the bodies where they will never be found. The tribal delegation simply vanished, and without their leadership, the remaining families had no choice but to accept the new boundaries Morrison dictated, but it was what they found tucked between the journal's back pages that provided the most damning evidence of all. A faded photograph, carefully preserved in oiled cloth, showed 5 men standing in front of what appeared to be a military tent. Silas recognized his father immediately, younger but unmistakable. Next to him stood a man in a Confederate officer's uniform who had to be Captain Morrison, and 3 other men whose faces bore the hard expressions of men accustomed to violence. On the back of the photograph, in his father's handwriting, were the names Jonas Boone, Captain James Morrison, Thomas Whitfield, Chief Spotted Wolf, War Chief Standing Bear, last counseled before the Bitter Creek Treaty. August 15th, 1863. "Spotted Wolf and Standing Bear are in this picture," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Father had them pose for a photograph before he helped murder them." The casual cruelty of it struck both men silent. To arrange a photograph with men you intended to kill, to preserve their images as some kind of trophy, spoke to a level of calculated malice that neither brother had imagined their father capable of. "There's more," Silas said, pointing to additional papers they'd discovered in a wooden box beneath the main crates. "Property deeds, survey maps, correspondence with territorial officials. It looks like this was bigger than just our ranch." The documents revealed a conspiracy that stretched across multiple properties and involved several prominent territorial figures. Morrison had orchestrated a scheme to invalidate tribal claims across thousands of acres, using fabricated treaties and manufactured evidence of tribal hostility to justify seizing their land. The Confederate gold had been payment not just for Jonas Boone's participation, but for his silence about the scope of the operation. "Look at this map," Thomas said, spreading out a hand-drawn survey that showed property boundaries extending far beyond the current Boone Ranch. "According to this, our land was just a small part of what they stole." Morrison granted parcels to at least a dozen accomplices. Silas studied the map, recognizing several neighboring properties that had been in the same families since the war years. The Morrison spread, the Garrett place, even part of what became the town of Cedar Falls. All of it was tribal land originally. The implications were staggering. If their father's journal told the truth, then half the county was built on stolen land and murder. The territorial officials who had validated the new claims had been paid accomplices, and the tribal families who might have contested the theft had been eliminated or driven away. As they absorbed the magnitude of what they'd discovered, Miguel's voice called from above. "Señor Silas, riders coming!" Both brothers quickly gathered the most damaging evidence and climbed back to the house. Through the parlor window, they could see 3 men approaching on horseback, their dust trail suggesting they'd been riding hard. One wore a territorial marshal's badge, while the other 2 had the look of federal agents. This is about the land patents, Silas said grimly. They're moving faster than I expected. Thomas straightened his own badge and ran a hand through his hair, the lawman in him responding instinctively to the approaching authority. Let me handle this. I know how these investigations work. The conversation with the federal agents was tense but professional. They had come following up on Walsh's initial report, armed with additional questions about the property's history and armed with federal warrants that gave them broad authority to investigate potential fraud in territorial land grants. We're particularly interested in properties that were granted during the 1863-1865 period, the lead agent explained. There's evidence of systematic fraud involving tribal lands, Confederate gold, and territorial officials who were later found to have accepted bribes. Thomas managed to answer their questions without revealing anything about the chamber beneath the house. But Silas could see the strain it was causing his brother. Every instinct Thomas had as a peace officer was telling him to reveal what they'd found, to turn over evidence that could help bring justice even 30 years after the crimes were committed. After the agents departed, with promises to return with more specific questions, Thomas confronted his brother directly. "We're obstructing a federal investigation," he said flatly. "Every minute we keep that evidence hidden, we're becoming accomplices to Father's crimes. We're protecting our family," Silas shot back. "And what about Miguel? What about the hands who depend on this place for work? You want to destroy all their lives for crimes they had nothing to do with." "The crimes were committed in our name," Thomas exploded. "Every day we've lived on this land, every dollar we've earned from it, has been built on murder and theft. How can you live with that?" Their argument was interrupted by Miguel appearing in the parlor doorway, his expression troubled. "Señores, forgive me, but I could not help but hear. Is there something wrong with the ranch? Something I should know about?" Silas and Thomas exchanged glances, realizing that their loyal foreman had picked up more of their conversation than they'd intended. Miguel had been with the family for 15 years, had worked harder and more faithfully than anyone had a right to expect. If the truth came out, his livelihood would be destroyed along with everything else. "There are some questions about the land patents," Silas said carefully. "Nothing for you to worry about." But Miguel's dark eyes showed he wasn't convinced. "Señor, in my village we have a saying. The earth remembers what men try to forget. If there is something in the past that threatens the present, it is better to face it than to let it fester like an untreated wound." The wisdom in the simple words hit both brothers hard. Miguel, who had no formal education but whose grandfather had lived through the territorial wars, understood something about the weight of historical injustice that they were still struggling to grasp. That evening, as Thomas fought the urge to drink, and Silas wrestled with the pressure from creditors who seemed to sense weakness, both men found themselves returning again and again to the faded photograph. The faces of Spotted Wolf and Standing Bear looked out at them across 3 decades, dignified men who had trusted in diplomacy and died for their faith in human decency. They were somebody's fathers, Thomas said quietly, holding the photograph up to the lamplight. Somebody's brothers, somebody's sons. They had families who never knew what happened to them, who probably spent years wondering if they'd done something wrong, if they'd failed their people somehow. Silas looked at the photograph and saw not just the victims of his father's crimes, but the generations of descendants who had been denied their rightful inheritance. The weight of that realization settled on his shoulders like a physical burden, heavier than any debt to any bank. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and making the old house creak and settle. Somewhere beneath their feet, the evidence of 3 decades of lies waited in the darkness, patient as the earth itself, while 2 brothers struggled to find the courage to face a truth that would change everything they thought they knew about justice, family, and the price of keeping secrets. Thomas woke before dawn, his hands shaking not from drink this time, but from the vivid dreams that had plagued his sleep. In those dreams, he'd worn his badge with pride again, had stood before judges and juries presenting evidence that brought justice to victims long silenced. But each time he'd reached for the evidence in his dreams, it had crumbled to dust in his hands, leaving him holding nothing but his own shame. He found Silas already in the kitchen, coffee brewing and account books spread across the table in neat columns that told the story of their financial ruin. The mortgage payment was now 3 weeks overdue, and the bank had sent increasingly stern letters about foreclosure proceedings. "Can't sleep either?" Silas asked, without looking up from his calculations. "Dreaming about the dead," Thomas replied, accepting the offered coffee cup. "About what we owe them." "What we owe them won't pay the mortgage," Silas said, though his tone carried less conviction than his words. "And it won't keep Miguel and his family from losing their home along with ours." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the kitchen door. Through the window, they could see an elderly Native American man standing patiently in the pre-dawn darkness, his weathered hands holding what appeared to be a ceremonial staff. Silas opened the door cautiously. "Can I help you?" "I am Joseph Standing Bear," the man said in careful English. "Grandson of War Chief Standing Bear. I have come because the spirits have told me it is time." The name hit both brothers like a physical blow. Standing Bear, one of the men in their father's photograph, one of the victims of the conspiracy that had built their ranch. "Time for what?" Thomas asked, his hand instinctively moving toward his badge. "Time for the truth to be spoken," Joseph replied simply. "My grandfather and Chief Spotted Wolf have been waiting 30 years for someone to tell their story. Last night, the wind carried their voices to me, and they said the sons of Jonas Boone were ready to listen." Without waiting for invitation, Joseph walked past them into the kitchen and settled into a chair with the dignity of a man accustomed to being heard. His eyes, sharp despite his advanced age, took in the account books, the stress lines on both brothers' faces, and the guilty weight that seemed to hang over them like smoke. "You have found something," he said. It wasn't a question. Thomas and Silas exchanged glances. Then Thomas made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. "Yes, we've found evidence about what happened during the war, about what our father did." Joseph nodded slowly. "My grandfather told me the story before he died, how Jonas Boone pretended to be a friend, how he arranged the meeting that became a trap. My grandfather escaped the first ambush, lived long enough to tell his family what really happened before the soldiers found our winter camp and finished what they had started." The old man's words carried no anger, only the weight of long-carried sorrow. "For 30 years, our people have known the truth about this land. We have watched the Boone family prosper on ground that was watered with our blood, and we have waited for the earth itself to demand justice." "Why now?" Silas asked. "Why come forward after all this time?" "Because the earth is tired of secrets," Joseph replied, "and because my grandfather's spirit grows restless. He appears to me in dreams, showing me visions of papers hidden in darkness, of gold that burns the hands that hold it, of young men who have a chance to heal old wounds if they have the courage." Thomas felt something shift inside him, a clarity that had been missing since his first drink years ago. What would healing look like? What would justice look like after 30 years? Before Joseph could answer, Miguel burst through the kitchen door, his face flushed with excitement and concern. "Señores, there are more men coming. Federal agents, and they have wagons. It looks like they plan to search the property thoroughly." Through the window, they could see a substantial party approaching. Federal marshals, territorial officials, and what appeared to be surveyors with equipment for a comprehensive investigation. The time for keeping secrets was rapidly running out. "There's something else you need to see," Silas said to Thomas, making a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. "More evidence we haven't shown you yet," leading his brother and Joseph back to the hidden chamber. Silas revealed additional tunnels that branched off from the main room, spaces he'd discovered during his solitary explorations. In the furthest chamber, they found evidence that chilled all 3 men to the bone. Military commission papers, bearing official seals and signatures, revealed that Jonas Boone had been granted special authority by territorial commanders to pacify hostile elements in the region. The commission gave him legal cover for actions that would otherwise have been considered murder, essentially licensing him to eliminate tribal resistance through any means necessary. He wasn't just a conspirator, Thomas said, his voice hollow as he read the documents. He was an official agent of the territorial government. Everything he did was sanctioned, approved, authorized by men who are probably still alive and still in positions of power. But it was the final document in the collection that revealed the true scope of the deception. A post-war report, filed with territorial authorities in 1866, detailed how Jonas Boone had continued his activities even after the war ended, using his commission to justify the seizure of additional tribal lands and the relocation of families who refused to accept the new boundaries. 20 families, Joseph said quietly, reading over Thomas's shoulder. 20 families that disappeared between 1863 and 1867. Men, women, children, all gone, their names erased from the territorial records as if they had never existed. The commission letter in Thomas's hands felt like it weighed more than lead. His father hadn't been a reluctant participant in wartime atrocities. He had been a professional killer, sanctioned by the government and paid in stolen gold to eliminate people whose only crime was living on land that other men wanted. Above them, they could hear boots on the floorboards, voices calling out official announcements about federal search warrants. The agents had arrived and were beginning their investigation. Within hours, possibly minutes, they would discover the hidden chamber and everything it contained. "We have a choice to make," Thomas said, his voice steady for the first time in months. "We can try to hide this evidence, protect our family's reputation, and keep the ranch. Or we can do what I swore to do when I first put on this badge. Ensure that justice is served, even when it's painful." "And Miguel?" Silas asked. "And the other families who depend on this place will be better served by truth than by lies," Joseph said firmly. "Land that is built on murder and theft will never bring prosperity to anyone. It will only create more suffering, more injustice, more generations of pain." Miguel appeared at the tunnel entrance, having followed them down. His face showed no surprise at the chamber's contents, only a deep sadness that suggested he had suspected something like this for years. "Senor," he said to Silas, "my grandmother used to tell stories about the families that vanished during the war years. She said the land would never be right until the truth was spoken aloud. Perhaps it is time to listen to the wisdom of grandmothers." Above them, the federal agents were calling for the property owners to present themselves. Thomas tucked the military commission into his coat and looked at his brother with eyes that were clearer than they had been in years. "I became a lawman because I believed in justice," he said. "I lost my way when I forgot that justice sometimes demands personal sacrifice. But this is our chance to remember who we're supposed to be." Silas looked around the chamber one final time, at the gold that could save his ranch, at the artifacts that represented lives stolen and cultures destroyed, at the evidence that could ruin his family's name, but might finally bring peace to the victims of his father's crimes. "God help us," he said quietly. "Let's go tell them the truth." As they climbed back toward the light, each man carried with him the weight of decision and the hope that 30 years of silence might finally be broken by the courage to speak uncomfortable truths. Behind them, the chamber waited in darkness, patient as justice itself, ready to yield its secrets to the light of day. As they emerged from the tunnel, the sound of official voices grew louder. Federal Marshal William Hayes was directing his men to begin a systematic search of the property, their authority backed by warrants that gave them broad powers to investigate territorial land fraud. Thomas straightened his badge and walked out to meet them, Silas and Joseph following close behind. "Marshal Hayes," Thomas called out, his voice carrying the professional tone he hadn't used in months. "Sheriff Thomas Boone, I believe we have information relevant to your investigation. Hayes, a tall man with steel-grey hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command, studied Thomas with sharp eyes that took in both the badge and the obvious signs of recent hard living. Sheriff Boone, we've heard about you. Didn't expect to find you here. This is my family's ranch, Thomas replied. And we've discovered evidence that I believe you need to see. Before Hayes could respond, one of his deputies called out from near the house. Marshal, found something unusual here. Looks like there's been recent digging under the building. The deputy had discovered the loose floorboard, though Thomas realized they'd been careless in replacing it after their last visit to the chamber. The investigators had the kind of trained eyes that noticed when things didn't sit quite right. Show us, Hayes commanded. There was no turning back now. Thomas led the federal agents to the parlor and lifted the floorboard, revealing the tunnel entrance. As Hayes lowered himself into the passage with practiced efficiency, Thomas felt the last vestiges of his father's secrets slipping away like sand through his fingers. The reaction from the chamber below was immediate and explosive. Hayes's voice echoed up through the tunnel opening, sharp with disbelief and professional excitement. Jesus Christ! Deputy Morrison, get down here now and bring the evidence kit. Within minutes, federal agents were cataloging the contents of the chamber with the methodical precision of experienced investigators. But it was what they found in the deepest part of the tunnel system that transformed their investigation. From routine fraud inquiry into something much darker, hidden behind a false wall that had been carefully constructed to look like solid earth. The agents discovered a final cache of documents that Jonas Boone had apparently hoped would never see daylight. Among them was the original land deed for the Boone Ranch property, and the comparison with the version filed in territorial records revealed a deception so bold it took everyone's breath away. The signatures are completely different, Deputy Morrison announced, holding up both documents for comparison. This original deed shows the land was granted to Chief Spotted Wolf and his tribe in perpetuity, signed by Territorial Governor Samuel Crawford in 1862. But the deed in the official records shows the same land granted to Jonas Boone in 1863, with Crawford's signature forged so skillfully it's almost undetectable. Hayes studied both documents with the intensity of a man who had seen every form of fraud imaginable but had rarely encountered something this brazen. This isn't just theft, he said grimly. This is systematic erasure of legal rights on a scale that approaches governmental conspiracy. But the discovery that stunned everyone into silence was a leather portfolio containing correspondence between Jonas Boone and various territorial officials, including detailed plans for what they euphemistically called tribal relocation. The letters revealed that the murders of Spotted Wolf and Standing Bear hadn't been the end of the conspiracy. They had been just the beginning. One letter, dated September 1863, laid out the full scope of the operation with chilling clarity. The Spotted Wolf matter has been resolved permanently, and his people are no longer in a position to contest the new boundaries. However, we have encountered unexpected resistance from Union Captain Thomas Whitfield, who has begun asking uncomfortable questions about tribal disappearances. J. Boone reports that Whitfield must be dealt with before he can file his report with federal authorities. Thomas read the letter with growing horror, understanding that his father hadn't just been a participant in the murder of tribal leaders. He had also been involved in killing the one Union officer who had tried to investigate the crimes and bring the perpetrators to justice. Captain Whitfield, Joseph said quietly, reading over Thomas's shoulder. He was the one who tried to help our people. My grandfather told me about him, a good man who died trying to do the right thing. Hayes was examining additional documents when he made a discovery that sent shockwaves through everyone present. Tucked inside the portfolio was a detailed inventory of trophies taken from victims, written in Jonas Boone's careful handwriting. The list included not just the tribal artifacts they had already found, but personal items taken from the bodies of murdered families. 23 confirmed kills between 1863 and 1867, Hayes read aloud, his voice tight with controlled anger. Men, women, and children, their personal effects catalogued like hunting trophies. And according to this, there are more burial sites scattered across the territory. Marked on this map, the map Hayes held up showed the locations of at least a dozen grave sites, some marked with cryptic symbols that appeared to indicate the number of bodies buried at each location. The scope of the murders was staggering, an entire campaign of genocide disguised as territorial settlement. But the final revelation came when Deputy Morrison discovered a hidden compartment in the largest crate, containing what appeared to be military correspondence. The papers revealed that Captain James Morrison, the Confederate officer who had orchestrated the conspiracy, had continued his activities after the war by securing a position in the territorial government. Morrison became Territorial Land Commissioner in 1868, Hayes announced after studying the documents. He spent 15 years in that position, which means he had the authority to validate his own fraudulent land grants and cover up the evidence of his crimes. The implications were staggering. Not only had the Boone Ranch been built on stolen land and murder, but the entire territorial land system had been corrupted from within by men who had used their positions to legitimize theft and genocide on a massive scale. Thomas felt something fundamental shift inside him as the full scope of his father's crimes became clear. This wasn't just about his family's reputation or their ranch. It was about justice for dozens of murdered families, about restoring rights that had been stolen through the most brutal means imaginable. "There's something else," Silas said quietly, drawing everyone's attention to a bundle of papers he'd found tucked behind the inventory. Letters from other families, other ranchers who were part of the conspiracy. The letters revealed that Jonas Boone had been part of a network of at least 20 families who had participated in the systematic theft of tribal lands. Each family had received a portion of the stolen territory in exchange for their silence about the murders, creating a web of complicity that had protected the secret for 3 decades. "Half the county," Thomas said, reading through the list of names. "Half the established families in this region built their prosperity on murder and theft." Hayes was already making plans for expanded investigations, for excavations at the burial sites marked on Jonas Boone's map, for federal charges that would reach back 30 years to finally bring justice for crimes that had been hidden in darkness for too long. But as the federal agents continued their work, Thomas realized that the discovery of his father's crimes had created an impossible moral situation. Every instinct he had as a peace officer demanded that he cooperate fully with the investigation, that he help bring justice, even if it destroyed his family's reputation completely. Yet Silas stood beside him, watching their entire life collapse around them, facing not just the loss of their ranch, but the knowledge that everything they had believed about their family had been a lie. And Miguel waited nearby, along with the other families who depended on the ranch for their livelihood, all of them innocent of crimes committed before they were born. "The whole county is going to be turned upside down," Thomas said to Hayes. "Every family, every property claim, every foundation of the community, all of it built on lies. Justice doesn't concern itself with convenience," Hayes replied firmly. "These crimes demand accountability, regardless of how much time has passed or how many people might be affected." As the sun began to set over the ranch that was no longer theirs in any meaningful sense, Thomas and Silas stood together, facing the wreckage of everything they had thought they knew about their lives. The forged land deed in Hayes's evidence bag represented more than just fraudulent paperwork. It was proof that their entire existence had been built on a foundation of murder and theft. And somewhere in the growing darkness, the spirits of Spotted Wolf, Standing Bear, Captain Whitfield, and dozens of other victims waited for a justice that was finally, after 30 years of silence, beginning to emerge into the light. The federal investigation moved with the swift efficiency of a machine that had been wound too tightly for too long. Within hours of Hayes's discovery, telegraph wires hummed with messages to territorial capitals and federal offices, setting in motion a legal process that would reshape the entire region. But for Thomas and Silas, the machinery of justice felt like a slow-motion avalanche that they could see coming, but were powerless to stop. Thomas spent the evening in conversation with Marshal Hayes, providing every detail he could remember about his father's later years, searching his memory for clues that might help identify other victims or locate additional burial sites. The work felt like excavating his own soul, digging through childhood memories that had once brought comfort but now carried the weight of terrible knowledge. "Your father kept meticulous records," Hayes observed, studying the inventory of victims with the clinical detachment of a professional investigator. "That's going to help us identify remains and notify surviving family members, but it also means the evidence against him is overwhelming." "What about the statute of limitations?" Silas asked, though his voice carried little hope. "Surely after 30 years, there's no statute of limitations on murder," Hayes replied firmly. "And the federal government has a particular interest in crimes committed against tribal peoples. This investigation is going to go all the way to Washington." As if to emphasize his point, another telegram arrived announcing the imminent arrival of federal prosecutors, tribal representatives, and territorial officials who would oversee what was already being called the largest investigation of territorial-era crimes in the region's history. That night, Thomas made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of reaching for the bottle of whiskey that had been his constant companion for years, he spent the evening writing letters. The first was to tribal leaders throughout the territory, informing them of the discovery and asking for their cooperation in identifying victims and recovering artifacts. The second was to federal officials, offering his full cooperation as both a witness and a peace officer who understood the legal complexities involved. "You don't have to do this," Silas said, watching his brother work by lamplight. "You could walk away, let the federal agents handle it without destroying yourself in the process." "I've been walking away from my responsibilities for years," Thomas replied, not looking up from his writing. "It's time to start walking toward them instead." The next morning brought visitors from every direction. Joseph Standing Bear returned with 3 other tribal elders, their faces grave but determined as they prepared to bear witness to truths that had been buried for too long. From the opposite direction came territorial officials, their carriages raising dust clouds that could be seen for miles across the prairie. But it was the third group of visitors that created the most tension. Word of the discovery had spread through the network of families whose prosperity had been built on the same foundation of theft and murder. And several of them had come to the Boone Ranch to gauge the threat to their own positions. "This could destroy us all," said William Garrett, whose family had been among those listed in Jonas Boone's correspondence. "If this investigation expands to include everyone who received stolen land, half the county will be ruined." "That's the idea," Thomas replied, with a bluntness that surprised everyone present. "Justice isn't supposed to be convenient for criminals." The conversation that followed was heated and sometimes ugly, as men who had built their lives on stolen foundations tried to convince the Boone brothers to find a way to contain the damage. Offers were made, financial compensation, political influence, even threats of violence, but Thomas remained unmoved. It was during this tense gathering that Miguel made a discovery that changed everything. While the adults argued in the parlor, he had been exploring the chamber below, looking for anything that might have been missed during the initial investigation. In the deepest corner of the tunnels, behind a pile of rocks that appeared to have been deliberately placed, he found a wrapped bundle that contained their father's service revolver and a final letter. The weapon was a Colt Army revolver, its metal stained with rust and what appeared to be dried blood. The letter, written in Jonas Boone's shaking handwriting and dated just weeks before his death, was his final confession. "To my sons," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then the weight of my sins has finally become too heavy for the earth to bear. I have carried the truth of what I did for 27 years, and it has poisoned every moment of joy, every success, every blessing that should have been clean but was instead built on blood." The confession detailed not just the murders and theft that had already been discovered, but additional crimes that painted an even darker picture of Jonas Boone's activities. He had personally killed at least 12 people, including women and children, who had witnessed the massacre of their leaders. He had helped bury entire families in unmarked graves scattered across the territory, and he had lived with the knowledge that his prosperity was built on the suffering of innocent people. "The gold burns my hands when I touch it," the letter continued. "The land itself seems to cry out against me when I walk across it. I have tried to do good works, to help neighbors and build something worthwhile, but nothing can wash away the stain of what I have done. The only mercy I can hope for is that my sons will find the courage to make right what I made wrong, to return what was stolen, and to speak for those who can no longer speak for themselves." The letter's final paragraph contained specific instructions about the location of additional burial sites and hidden caches of stolen artifacts, information that would prove crucial to the federal investigation. But it also contained a personal plea that struck both brothers to their core. "I have been a coward," Jonas Boone had written. "I have chosen my family's comfort over justice for the murdered, my reputation over truth for the wronged. Do not follow my example. Be the men I should have been. Face the consequences I was too weak to face. Give the dead the justice they deserve, even if it costs you everything." Thomas read the letter aloud to the assembled group, his voice steady despite the weight of the words. When he finished, the parlor was silent, except for the sound of wind through the eaves and the distant lowing of cattle that would soon belong to someone else. "This changes everything," Marshal Hayes said finally. "With this confession and the additional evidence, we have enough to pursue charges against everyone involved in the original conspiracy, those who are still alive. Anyway, but it was Joseph Standing Bear who spoke the words that everyone was thinking. The question now is what the sons of Jonas Boone will choose to do with the truth their father was too frightened to speak. Silas looked around the room at the faces of neighbors who had become adversaries, at federal officials who represented a justice that would destroy his life, at tribal elders who carried the pain of generations. The Confederate gold below could still save his ranch if he chose to fight the investigation, to claim ignorance and hide behind legal technicalities. The artifacts could be returned quietly, the burial sites left undisturbed, the whole matter allowed to fade back into the darkness where it had hidden for so long. But Miguel stepped forward, holding the blood-stained revolver with the reverence due to evidence of terrible crimes. "Senor," he said to Silas, "my family came to this land as refugees from violence in Mexico. We came here believing it was a place where people could start fresh, where the past did not have to define the future. But now I understand that this land has never been free from violence, has never been clean. Perhaps it is time to wash it clean at last." Thomas felt something shift inside him as he watched his brother wrestle with the choice that would define the rest of their lives. For the first time in years, his thinking was completely clear, unclouded by alcohol or self-pity. The badge on his chest felt like it carried its proper weight again, reminding him of the oath he had taken to serve justice, regardless of personal cost. "The meeting is tomorrow," Hayes announced. "Territorial representatives, tribal leaders, federal prosecutors. They'll want a formal statement from both of you, and they'll want to know whether you're going to cooperate with the investigation or fight it." As the various parties prepared to leave until the following day's formal proceedings, Thomas and Silas found themselves alone in the house that no longer felt like home. The rooms seemed to echo with voices from the past, their father's guilt-ridden confessions, the cries of murdered families, the sound of earth being shoveled over hastily buried bodies. "We could still run," Silas said quietly. Take what we can carry and disappear before tomorrow's meeting. Start over somewhere else, and live the rest of our lives as fugitives from our own consciences?" Thomas replied, "Father tried that. Look how it worked out for him. Outside, darkness was falling over land that had been watered with blood and built on lies. Tomorrow would bring a reckoning that had been 30 years in the making. A moment when two brothers would have to choose between the comfortable lie they had inherited and the uncomfortable truth that might finally bring peace to the dead. In his pocket, Thomas carried his father's final letter, a confession that demanded action. In his heart, he carried the weight of justice too long delayed. And in his hands, he held the power to speak for victims who had waited 3 decades for someone to tell their story to the world. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Boone Ranch, as if the sky itself understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. By 8 o'clock, carriages and riders had begun arriving from every direction, converging on the property that had become the focal point of the largest investigation of territorial crimes in the region's history. The tribal delegation arrived first, led by Joseph Standing Bear and including representatives from 5 different tribes whose members had vanished during the 1860s. They came with the dignity of people who had waited generations for this moment, carrying sacred items and ceremonial regalia that spoke of the gravity they placed on the proceedings. Thomas watched from the porch as the tribal leaders formed a semicircle near the house, their presence transforming the familiar landscape into something that felt both ancient and urgent. Among them was an elderly woman who carried a ceremonial knife in an ornate sheath, its blade gleaming with silver inlay that caught the morning light. "That belonged to my great-grandmother," Joseph explained, following Thomas's gaze. "She was Chief Spotted Wolf's daughter. The knife was passed down through our family as a symbol of justice delayed but never abandoned." The federal officials arrived next. Marshal Hayes, 2 territorial prosecutors, and a representative from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, whose stern expression suggested he understood the far-reaching implications of what they had discovered. Behind them came the local families whose land claims would be called into question, their faces showing the strain of men who had spent sleepless nights contemplating the destruction of everything they had built. At precisely 9 o'clock, Marshal Hayes called the assembly to order in the parlor of the Boone house. The room that had once sheltered 3 generations of family secrets now served as a courthouse where truth would finally be spoken aloud. "We are here," Hayes announced, "to formally receive evidence related to crimes committed between 1863 and 1867 in the theft of tribal lands and the murder of tribal citizens. Mr. Silas Boone, you have indicated your willingness to provide testimony and evidence. Please proceed." Silas stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room upon him. In his hands, he held his father's blood-stained journal, the confession letter, and the inventory of victims. The words he was about to speak would destroy everything his family had built, but they would also begin the process of justice that had been delayed for 30 years. "My father, Jonas Boone, was a murderer," he said simply, his voice carrying across the silent room like a judgment. "He participated in the systematic murder of tribal leaders and families. He stole their land through forged documents, and he built our family's prosperity on the blood of innocent people." The admission hit the room like a physical blow. Even those who had suspected the truth were stunned by the blunt honesty of Silas's words. Several of the neighboring landowners shifted uncomfortably, knowing that their own families' histories might be called into similar question. Thomas stepped forward to stand beside his brother, his badge catching the light as he spoke. "As a peace officer sworn to uphold justice, I support my brother's testimony and offer my full cooperation with this investigation. The evidence speaks for itself, and it demands that we face the truth regardless of personal cost." Joseph Standing Bear rose from his seat, accepting the journal from Silas's hands with the solemnity of someone receiving sacred remains. For 30 years, our people have grieved for family members who vanished without explanation. Today, we finally learn what became of them. The reading of Silas Boone's journal entries took nearly an hour, each passage revealing new depths of planned brutality and calculated theft. As the details emerged, several of the tribal representatives wept openly, finally learning the fate of grandparents and great-grandparents whose disappearances had haunted their families for decades. When the journal reading concluded, Silas led the entire assembly down into the hidden chamber. The sight of the Confederate gold, the stolen artifacts, and the carefully catalogued trophies of murder stunned even the federal investigators who had thought they were prepared for anything. "We return all of this to its rightful owners," Silas announced, gesturing toward the collection of stolen items. "The gold, the artifacts, whatever compensation the law demands, all of it belongs to the families of the people my father helped to murder." The elderly woman with the ceremonial knife stepped forward, examining artifacts that had belonged to her family for generations before their theft. When she found a beaded necklace that had been her great-grandmother's, tears streamed down her weathered cheeks as she held it against her heart. "This was buried with my ancestor," she said softly. "My father told me stories of how beautiful it was, how it had been passed down for 7 generations. We thought it was lost forever." Marshal Hayes documented each piece of evidence with methodical precision, but even his professional demeanor couldn't hide his shock at the scope of the crimes. "This represents the largest cache of evidence from territorial-era crimes ever discovered," he announced. "The prosecution will be seeking the maximum penalties available under federal law." The legal implications were staggering. The forged land deed meant that not only did the Boone family have no legal claim to their property, but they would be liable for 30 years of profits earned from stolen land. The Confederate gold would be confiscated as evidence, and any remaining assets would likely be seized for victim compensation. As the formal proceedings continued, Silas felt a strange sense of relief washing over him. The weight he had carried since discovering the chamber was finally being shared. The burden of terrible knowledge distributed among people who had the authority and responsibility to act upon it. But the relief was tempered by the knowledge that his life, as he had known it, was ending. The ranch would be taken. The family name would be forever associated with murder and theft, and he would likely face criminal charges as an accessory after the fact for attempting to conceal evidence. Thomas, meanwhile, felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the satisfaction of serving justice without compromise. His badge felt properly weighted again, his oath restored to its original meaning. Whatever personal cost this day might bring, he was finally doing the work he had been called to do. As the morning's proceedings drew to a close, the ceremonial knife in the elderly woman's hands caught the light streaming through the parlor window. The blade seemed to pulse with an energy that spoke of justice delayed, but finally arriving, of truth that had been buried in darkness, but was now emerging into the light of day. As the afternoon wore on, the formal proceedings gave way to something more profound than legal testimony. Joseph Standing Bear called for a recess in the official proceedings and requested that the tribal representatives be allowed to confer privately. When they returned an hour later, the elderly woman who carried the ceremonial knife also bore a sacred peace pipe, its carved bowl gleaming with age and spiritual significance. "We have discussed what justice means to our people," Joseph announced to the assembled group. "And we have concluded that justice is not only about punishment for past wrongs, but about healing for future generations." Marshal Hayes looked skeptical. "Mr. Standing Bear, while I appreciate the cultural perspective, we're dealing with federal crimes that demand prosecution under territorial law. The evidence of murder and theft is overwhelming." "The evidence is indeed overwhelming," Joseph agreed. "But the perpetrator of these crimes is dead and has been for 7 years. His sons were children when these crimes were committed, and they have shown courage in bringing the truth to light when they could have chosen to hide it forever." Thomas stepped forward. his law enforcement experience giving him insight into the complex negotiations that were beginning to unfold. "What are you proposing?" The elderly woman spoke for the first time since identifying her family's artifacts. "I am Mary Spotted Wolf, great-granddaughter of Chief Spotted Wolf. I carry the authority of my people to speak for justice." She lifted the peace pipe, its carved surface reflecting the afternoon light. "This pipe belonged to my great-grandfather. It was used to seal agreements between peoples, to create peace where there had been conflict." She paused, looking directly at Silas and Thomas. "Your father took our land, our lives, our sacred items. But you have returned what could be returned, and you have spoken truth when lies would have been easier. This matters to the spirits of our ancestors." Silas felt something shift in the room's atmosphere, a sense that forces larger than legal proceedings were at work. "What would true justice look like to your people?" Mary Spotted Wolf consulted with the other tribal representatives in their native language, their conversation carrying the weight of cultural wisdom accumulated over generations. When they reached consensus, she turned back to address the entire assembly. "The land must be returned to its rightful stewardship," she said firmly. "But stewardship does not mean ownership in the way white law understands it. The land belongs to all people who will care for it with respect and honor the memory of those who died protecting it." Thomas recognized the framework of a negotiated settlement, one that could satisfy both legal requirements and tribal justice. "Are you proposing some form of joint custody? A way for the land to serve both legal restitution and ongoing stewardship?" "Precisely," Joseph Standing Bear confirmed. "The Boone family would deed their claim to a tribal trust, but would be allowed to remain as caretakers of the land, sharing the responsibilities and the modest profits with the families of victims. Miguel Hernandez and his family would be granted permanent residence and a share in the stewardship as well, in recognition of his loyalty and his family's own displacement by violence." The proposal was revolutionary in its scope and wisdom. Rather than simply seizing the land and evicting everyone connected to it, the tribal representatives were offering a path toward healing that acknowledged both the crimes of the past and the realities of the present. Marshal Hayes frowned as he considered the legal implications. This would require approval from federal authorities, territorial officials, and the courts. "It's not a simple matter of private negotiation. Nothing about justice is simple," Mary Spotted Wolf replied. "But sometimes the most complex problems require solutions that look beyond law to wisdom, beyond punishment to healing." Silas felt tears he hadn't expected gathering in his eyes as he grasped the magnitude of what was being offered. "You would allow us to stay? After what our father did to your families?" "Your father chose darkness," Joseph replied. "You have chosen light. The spirits of our ancestors are more interested in the direction you walk from this day forward than in punishing you for steps you did not take." Thomas found himself thinking about the oath he had taken as a peace officer, about the true meaning of justice that went beyond mere enforcement of law. "What would be required of us under this arrangement?" "Truth," Mary Spotted Wolf said simply. "The burial sites must be properly marked and honored. The story must be told so that future generations understand what happened here. And the land must be cared for in a way that honors both the living and the dead." The negotiations that followed were complex and emotional, involving federal prosecutors who had to be convinced that restorative justice could serve legal requirements, territorial officials who needed to approve unprecedented land arrangements, and families whose own claims might be affected by the precedent being set. But Thomas found that his experience as a lawman served him well in navigating the legal complexities. He worked with Hayes and the federal prosecutors to craft an arrangement that would satisfy federal requirements for restitution, while honoring the tribal representatives' vision of healing-centered justice. Miguel, when informed of his inclusion in the proposed arrangement, wept openly. "Senor," he said to Silas, "my family has never owned land, has never had the security of knowing we belong somewhere. To be offered this gift, especially after the truth of what happened here, it is more than we ever dreamed possible. As the day's negotiations drew to a close, Silas realized that he was facing the loss of everything he had thought mattered, the ranch as his private property, the family name's reputation, the simple certainty of ownership that had defined his entire life. But he was also being offered something he had never expected, the possibility of redemption, the chance to spend his remaining years serving something larger than his own interests. "I accept," he said formally, addressing Mary Spotted Wolf and the assembled tribal representatives. "On behalf of my family, I accept your terms and your mercy, and I pledge to spend whatever years remain to me in service of the truth and the land." Thomas stepped forward to stand beside his brother, their relationship finally healed by the shared weight of moral decision. "And I pledge my skills as a peace officer to ensure that this arrangement serves justice and protects all parties involved." Mary Spotted Wolf lifted the peace pipe, its carved surface catching the last light of afternoon. "Then let this pipe seal our agreement, as it sealed agreements between our peoples in times before the darkness fell. Let it represent our commitment to walk forward together toward a justice that serves both the living and the dead." As smoke from the sacred pipe rose toward the ceiling of the parlor, where so many secrets had been hidden, everyone present understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a resolution that honored both law and tradition, punishment and healing, the demands of justice and the possibilities of grace. 6 months after the peace pipe sealed their agreement, Silas Boone stood in the same spot where he had once surveyed his failing ranch with desperate eyes. The land looked different now, not because the physical landscape had changed, but because he understood its true history and his place within it. The new land deed hung framed in the parlor, its legal language carefully crafted to reflect the unprecedented arrangement between the tribal trust, the territorial government, and the families who would share stewardship of the property. Unlike his grandfather's fraudulent claim or his father's blood-stained legacy, this document represented something clean and honest, a commitment to truth, healing, and shared responsibility. Thomas had moved back to the ranch permanently, hanging up his badge in Amarillo to take on the role of liaison between the tribal trust and territorial authorities. His hands were steady now, his eyes clear in a way they hadn't been for years. The bottle that had been his constant companion sat unopened on a shelf, a reminder of struggles overcome rather than a crutch for struggles avoided. "Strange how losing everything can make a man rich," Thomas observed, joining his brother on the porch where they had shared so many conversations over the decades. "Father thought he was securing our future by stealing that gold. Turns out he was poisoning it." The ranch operated differently now, with a portion of its modest profits going to support tribal families, and another portion funding the ongoing work of locating and properly honoring burial sites scattered across the territory. It was harder work and smaller profits, but it was honest work that allowed both brothers to sleep peacefully for the first time in years. Miguel had embraced his new role as co-steward with the enthusiasm of a man who had never expected to own anything but had been granted a share in something meaningful. His family's small house had been expanded, and his children attended the new school that served both tribal and settler families, learning history that included all perspectives rather than just the victor's version. "Senor Silas," Miguel had said just the week before, "my grandmother always told us that stolen bread never satisfies hunger, that it leaves a taste of ash in the mouth. But bread earned through honest work feeds not just the body, but the soul." The investigation that had begun with their discovery had expanded beyond anyone's expectations. 12 other ranching families had been found to hold land, obtained through similar crimes, and federal prosecutors were pursuing what they called the largest case of territorial-era genocide ever documented. Not all of the affected families had chosen the path of cooperation and healing that the Boones had embraced, leading to legal battles that would continue for years. but Mary Spotted Wolf had become a frequent visitor to the ranch, working with Silas and Thomas to establish proper memorial sites for the burial grounds that had been discovered. Her great-grandfather's grave had been located using Silas Boone's detailed maps, and Chief Spotted Wolf's remains had finally been laid to rest according to tribal tradition in a ceremony that drew hundreds of people from across the territory. "He can rest now," she had told Silas after the ceremony, "and so can your father's spirit. The truth has been spoken, the dead have been honored, and the living are working together toward something better." The hidden chamber beneath the house had been converted into a memorial room where visitors could see the evidence of what had happened and understand both the crimes of the past and the hope for the future. School children came regularly, learning lessons about the cost of injustice and the possibility of redemption that couldn't be found in any textbook. Thomas had discovered that his years as a peace officer, combined with his personal experience of moral failure and recovery, made him uniquely qualified to help other families navigate the complex legal and emotional challenges of facing uncomfortable truths about their ancestors. He had become something between a mediator and a counselor, helping people find paths toward justice that served both legal requirements and healing needs. "I spent years drinking to forget my failures as a lawman," he had confided to Silas one evening. "Turns out the real work of justice isn't about arresting criminals. It's about helping people find the courage to do the right thing even when it costs them everything." Silas had found his own calling in the careful work of land stewardship. Working closely with tribal representatives, he had learned to see the property not as something to be exploited for maximum profit, but as something to be cared for with respect for its history and consideration for future generations. The cattle grazed more sustainably now, the water was managed more carefully, and every decision was made with consultation from people who understood the land's deeper significance. The financial pressures that had once seemed insurmountable had been resolved not through the discovery of Confederate gold, but through the patient work of building something honest and sustainable. The ranch produced enough to support all the families involved in its stewardship, and the modest profits were sufficient for people who had learned to measure wealth in terms of peace of conscience rather than accumulation of property. On quiet evenings, Silas often found himself thinking about the pocket watch that still carried the weight of family legacy, but now represented something different than it once had. The steady tick that had once marked time toward an uncertain future now counted moments in a life built on honest foundations. The coyotes still called across the prairie at sunset, but their voices no longer carried the loneliness they once had. They were part of a landscape that belonged to all the creatures who inhabited it, including human beings who had learned to see themselves as stewards rather than conquerors. "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas asked one evening as they watched the sun set over land that was simultaneously lost and found. "Giving up everything Father built for us?" Silas considered the question seriously, looking out over fields where tribal and settler families worked side by side, where memorial stones marked the graves of murder victims, where children learned the complex truth about their shared history. "I regret that it took us so long to find the courage to face the truth," he said finally, "but I don't regret losing something that was never really ours to begin with. What we have now, this peace, this honest work, this knowledge that we're finally serving something larger than ourselves, that's worth more than all the Confederate gold that was ever buried." The new land deed in their parlor was more than a legal document. It was a promise to future generations that some debts could be repaid, that some wounds could be healed, and that people who had the courage to face uncomfortable truths could find their way toward redemption. As darkness settled over the ranch, both brothers understood that their father's secrets had been transformed from a source of shame into a foundation for hope. The earth that had once held buried crimes now held planted seeds of justice, growing slowly but surely toward a harvest that would feed many generations to come.